All right, welcome you guys to lecture number 3. We are going to be talking about water, and that is the fluid of life. It's probably our most important nutrient. All living things really need water in some way, shape, or form. So let's go ahead and talk about water and why it's so important, and what happens if we don't get enough water. So first, let's do a little bit of review from last week. So that's how I'm going to start off all of our lectures, is doing a little bit of review. So first, let's talk a little bit about energy. So we said that we take our gross energy and we start breaking it down into what we're actually utilizing in our body for energy. So what was our first breakdown? That was digestible energy. So go ahead and pause the video if you want to look it up or try to remember what we said was digestible energy. How did we get that? Right, so that is our gross energy, or the kind of total potential energy of the nutrients of the diet, minus our fecal energy. So that's the energy we lose when we can't digest something, right? It goes out in the feces. So that's going to be our total digestible energy, because that's what we can actually break down and utilize into our body. Okay, so that's digestible energy. Now let's go ahead and do a calculation. So we did have an equation from our last lecture for maintenance requirements, right? So talking about maintaining weight, maintaining enough energy to do our basal metabolism, heat ourselves, maybe a little bit of physical exercise. So all these things that we said that went into maintenance energy and maintenance requirements. So what does a 1,100-pound horse require if we use our average maintenance requirement equation for mammals from last time? So again, you can look up, more specific maintenance requirements per species, but I'm probably going to ask you either our average maintenance requirement, or I'll give you that specific maintenance requirement. So you won't have to look anything up during the exam. But just so you know, right, there are differences between each species, but we're just going to go off of what the average maintenance requirements is for a mammal. And remember, our units are in kcals, or kilocalories per day. Okay, and if we remember back, a kilocalorie is the same as a big calorie, right, which is 1,000 small calories. Okay, so what are our steps to be able to figure out this equation? So number one, always see what weight we are given in the problem. So in this case, it's giving us the horse weight in pounds, right? So it's very common that we use pounds. That's just what we do, right? We're a pound type of society. We care about pounds. So it's usually what we use. But when we're in the world of nutrition, we need that weight to be in kilograms. Okay, so if we go back, what did we say? How many pounds are in a kilogram? We said that there are 2.2 pounds per kilogram. Okay. So that's going to be our number one calculation, is turning the pounds into kilograms. So we can do it the long way or the short way. Let's start with the long way. So if we have, let's see, let's put 2.2 pounds on the top. Right, so what we have and then what we want, right? So we have 2.2 pounds per kilogram. And what do we want, right? So X is what we want, and we have 1,100 pounds, right? So we have 1,100 pounds, so you put pounds and pounds on top, kilograms and kilograms on the bottom. So this is what we know, this is what we have, this is what we want, right? So now we can cross multiply to find our x, okay? So that's going to be 2.2x, our unknown, equals 1,100. I keep saying 1,000. 1,100, okay? So now we have to divide to get to x. We're going to divide 2.2. Divide by 2.2 to find x. Okay, so x equals 500. And what did we say that was? That was kilograms. Okay, so that's kilograms. So now we know our horse's weight in kilograms. Now, if you notice, it's about half, right, roughly. So the short way would be just to know that your kilogram weight is going to be a smaller number than your pound weight. So you could just straight divide 1,100 by 2.2. That would be the shortcut way to do it, okay? And that's just remembering, right? If you go pounds to kilograms, you divide. If you go kilograms to pounds, you multiply by that 2.2. Okay. Or if you forget that, you just remember how many pounds in a kilogram, you can always do the long way and work your way through the problem. So now that we have a weight in kilograms, we can plug it into our maintenance requirement equation. So we said for an average mammal, it's 140 times the weight in kilograms, right? Kilogram body weight. So we said that's 500 kilograms. And then to the power of 0.75. And if we remember back, where did we get that power, right? What does that mean? Why do we have to do it to a power of? So if we remember back, we were talking about how mass changes kind of our basal metabolic requirements, right? So we have to kind of take mass and body weight into account, right? So that's how we adjust for the body weight, for the mass, okay? So it's mass specific. So if we plug that all into our scientific calculator, we're going to get this crazy number, right? So 14,803. Don't worry about the decimals unless it's something that'll round it up. You can round up, but I don't worry too much about the decimals. So we said, what's our units? kcal, right? Kcal per day. So that means your average horse, maybe a little bit bigger than your average horse. We kind of say an average horse is about 500 kilograms, needs 14,800 roughly kcals per day, okay? And remember, kcals is our big calorie, right? So if we need 2,000, if we're talking about a human and you kind of say, okay, roughly we need about 2,000 calories a day. That big calorie, big C, is the same as kcal, okay? So that makes sense, right? They're quite a bit bigger than us, right? They're quite a bit bigger than us. So they're going to need quite a bit more calories than we do. Okay? So that is for the horse. And you can do this for really any animal where you have a weight, right? Or mammal, right? We're talking about mammals for this kind of average maintenance requirement. It's going to change for different species, and we won't really go into that too much for each individual species. We'll do a little bit about kind of how we calculate for some of the exotic species towards the end of the course, okay? But for now, we're just kind of talking about your average mammal, okay? So that's our answer. Sorry, it's under all of the writing there, but about 14,800 kcals, okay? All right, so now what are we going to talk about today? Okay, so let's leave energy behind and talk about water. So what are the functions of water, right? What does it do for us? Why do we need it? We're going to talk a little bit about body water. That means like, where does the water live in our body? How do we get water? What are the water sources? You know, obviously people are like, duh, you drink it. But there are other sources of water, right, that our body can get or have access to without actually physically drinking water, which is quite interesting. And it's very important for species that don't have the access to water that maybe other species do, like desert species or species that hibernate. Think about that. What do they do, right? They're hibernating for months on end. They're not drinking water. They're not even eating. Okay, so where does that water come from? Because you require water for survival. Okay, so we'll talk about that. What about water loss? How do we lose water? Well, yeah, we urinate, right? Sweat, things like that. So that's kind of water loss, right? What are our actual water requirements? So we'll talk a little bit about that, just like what are kind of our nutrient requirements or energy requirements, and what happens if we don't reach those requirements, and that's dehydration. So water is life, right? So that's kind of an easy, simplified way to talk about water, right? But we're going to talk a little more about the specifics of why we need water. So it makes up about 1/2 to 2/3 of our body mass. So that means the majority of us is water, okay? So that's important. We're made up of water, right? So we need it. And then I have a very fun video just of slow-mo of a dog versus a cat drinking water. So everybody drinks water a little bit differently maybe, but we all get water some way, shape, or form, right? That's just kind of cute to watch them. Especially the dog. It's kind of cool how they use their tongue to slop up water. It's kind of cool. All right, so what are those major functions of water in the body? So yes, big picture, body equals life, but why is that? What are the specifics? Well, we require water for all of our biochemical processes in our body. So any sort of thing in the body requires water in some way, shape, or form, whether you are producing water, utilizing water, all of these metabolic processes require water. So in that first picture, we've even talked about it when we're talking about cellular respiration, right, and photosynthesis, and how when we undergo cellular respiration, we're utilizing the sugar and the oxygen, and we're actually creating water. So that's metabolic water. So that's one way we can actually get water. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but we utilize that to create energy, right? So we're creating water and energy. So that's really important, okay? Another really important function is maintaining our body temperature. So water has a lot of special properties, and one of its special properties is its ability to hold heat. Okay, its heat specific capacity. So we'll talk a little bit about that more in depth and what that means, but essentially it can be heated up to high temperatures and not change its state, right? It would be really bad if we were in, 100-degree weather, even hotter, and our blood started to boil, right? That would be really bad. So the specific heat capacity of water is very important in maintaining body temperature. But it's also a way to cool. So we do have evaporative cooling as well. So we can cool our bodies by sending the water out to the surface of our body and evaporating or sweating, right? So that is another way. So we can maintain that perfect body temperature, which is very important for maintaining all of our cellular processes. So let's talk a little bit more about some of those biochemical processes that require water. Okay, so all biochemical reactions are going to utilize water in some way, shape, or form. So it can be used as a solvent, right? So compounds ionize in water. right? So it's a solvent. So just as a very basic example, right, you put salt in water and the salt dissolves, right? So it ionizes those individual elements. So it separates sodium and chloride, and you get a solution then, right? So the solvent is the water, your solute is the salt, and you get a solution, right? So that's very important, just in body function, right? It's also very important for transport, right? So digesta, blood, right? Solutes in blood, secretions, excretions. So again, if you think about how much water we actually have in our body, a lot of this is going towards transport, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about body water, essentially. Where does the water live in our body? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, okay? But it's a great solvent and it's a great transport mechanism for the body. So now let's talk a little bit about the chemical reactions it's involved in. So when we're talking about water, there's two main chemical reactions that utilize water. And the first is hydrolysis. So when we think about hydrolysis, we're talking about water being the substrate, meaning you put water into the reaction to create the product. Okay, so that's this example here at the bottom, right? So you use water to break another bond, to break a chemical bond, and create a product. So that's hydrolysis. So if you think hydrolysis, breaking water, hydro, and then lysis means to burst or break. So you're lysing the water. So you're breaking the water to create a reaction. So that's hydrolysis. Now, oxidation is where water is the product. Okay, so that's more of our cellular respiration reaction that we've already talked about, where you're creating water out of the reaction. Okay, so when we're talking about nutrition, we're really focused a little bit more on the hydrolysis, because water is really required for the metabolism of organic compounds. So organic compounds are all of our nutrients, right? All of the food that we eat, we need to break it down. So, and the amount of water required to break down these different organic compounds just depends on the organic compound. So if we're talking about fat and protein, it's going to require a bit more water than, say, a carbohydrate, okay? So that just is, how much water is required for the metabolism of a compound. Metabolism also increases our respiration and increases the heat dissipation, right? So we talked about kind of this in our energy lecture, where once you eat, right, you're going to increase the amount of energy you need, right? So once you're undergoing metabolism, you're going to kind of increase your respiration, increase the energy or the heat that you're giving off, which is also very important. So it's the process of metabolizing those organic compounds. Okay, so we kind of talked about that as heat increment in the previous lecture in energy. So that should sound somewhat familiar, right? So we've already kind of talked about this, but now we're talking about the water side of it, right? So we said that we had to break down those nutrients, right? The metabolism of those nutrients and the energy that's required. Well, now there's also water required too. Okay, so we're going to utilize that water to metabolize those compounds. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit more about water and body temperature. So we said that water is able to hold heat. Okay, so we call that the specific heat capacity of water. And it is higher than any other liquid or solid. It can hold a lot of heat. And what does that mean? So that's the amount of heat needed to raise 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. Okay, that's the specific heat capacity. And so it takes a lot of heat to turn water into steam, and that we call evaporation, right? So we're turning water into steam, we're changing the state of the water. So water in our body can store a lot of heat without changing our body temperature, which is really, really important. Okay, so it can store a lot of heat. So if we look at the graph and our kind of phases of water, right, it takes a lot to change that water into steam or gas, right? So that whole middle section, right, where it's water, that is important, right? So anything above that, but look at how much energy you've got to put in there, right? 2,261 joules per gram to be able to turn that water into steam. So it takes quite a lot, right? And that's good, right? We talked about that. We don't want our blood to boil. We don't want our temperature to change. So we can maintain a constant body temperature even in the face of different environmental temperatures, okay? And I have a cool video about burning a balloon with or without water in it. So it's kind of cool just to kind of visualize the specific heat capacity of water, okay? So I'll have that on Canvas for you so you can check it out. So where does all this water live in our body, right? So we said that the majority of us, of our body weight is water, right? Over a half of us, almost 2/3 of us. And that means that water makes up about 70–75% of our fat-free weight. So if you take fat out of the equation, that's how much water we have in us, okay? But where does that water live? Now the majority is intracellular fluid, okay? So we kind of go back to biology and cells, and most of the cells, right, are made up of water. Okay, so that's the water that's inside the cell membrane, okay, intracellular fluid. And that's 40%, okay? So that's a lot, okay? Now, extracellular fluid is about 20–30%. So that's interstitial fluid, kind of meaning in the tissues, okay? And in our blood vessels as blood plasma, right? So both of those together combined we call extracellular fluid, or outside the cell, okay? So that's quite a lot, right, as well. So that's kind of where we get a bit of our numbers, right? So of our fat-free body weight. So when it's talking about the body weight down there, it's fat-free body weight, okay? So we obviously do have some fluid in other parts of our body, right? So the majority is in the cells and outside the cells, kind of in our vessels and the tissues, but we do have some in the GI tract and the urinary tract. Obviously, a lot of you probably thought, oh, it's in the urinary tract because that's where we pee, right? So that must be where we store all of the fluid. Not necessarily, right? So that's actually a minor amount of water in comparison to how much is in the cells and the tissues. So we do have water in the gastrointestinal tract and the urinary tracts. Water does cross the cell membrane very readily, right? So we do have transfer of water in and out of the cells, in and out of the blood vessels. So there is movement of water across these different locations as well, right? So that's where all of the water lives in our body, right? So majority of it is in our cells, and outside the cells. So now let's get into how do we know how much water we need, right? So we may not really think about that. You may just kind of drink water throughout the day. Obviously, everyone tells you to drink more water, right? Drinking water is very healthy. But how does your body actually know how much water you need? Well, it monitors your blood volume. So blood volume is kind of a way for your body to keep an eye on what your body water level is. Okay, so it measures your blood volume in your kidneys and in your heart. And because it's so bad to have a low blood volume, it does a better job at absorbing water than it does to get rid of it. And this is why a lot of us, and especially as humans, a lot of us have trouble with high blood pressure. And it has to do kind of with this idea that it's better to have too much water in your blood, which can create high blood pressure, than not enough, right? So we have all of these safety mechanisms to counteract low blood volume, but not as many to counteract high blood volume or high blood pressure. So low blood volume triggers your kidneys to absorb more water in those renal tubules, in those tubules of the kidneys. So, you can go back to kind of anatomy and physiology and what your kidneys do, but they essentially filter all of your blood and they excrete the wastes and things like that into and produce urine. But it's filtering pretty much all of your blood, and you really only turn about 1% of that into urine. So it's absorbing all of that water, the majority of that water, back into the blood. So it has a very good way of absorbing water. And so it's able to absorb even more than that if necessary, right? So that's where kind of this monitoring your blood volume comes into play. It's really through the kidneys, okay? So the kidneys are monitoring, the heart is monitoring, and if there's any sort of trigger of a low blood volume, you're going to absorb more water back into the blood, okay? You also have this water turnover, right? So you're going to be excreting body water and you're going to replace that body water in the tissue. So there's kind of this constant turnover of water in your during metabolism. Right, so you're kind of going to get rid of some water, you're going to replace it, and so this water turnover balancing act is always happening, okay? So how do we absorb water in the body, right? So the majority of water is absorbed in the GI tract, which makes sense, right? We're drinking the water or we're eating the food and we're going to be extracting the water out of the GI tract. So in ruminants, a lot of that is happening in the rumen and the omasum, which are two chambers of their very large stomach. Okay, so that's happening a lot in their stomach essentially. But that's different than most species. Most species, there is some absorption in the small intestine, but mostly happens in the large intestine. Okay, and so most water absorption in most species is happening in the large intestine. So usually we get our nutrient absorption in the small intestine and water absorption in the large intestine or the colon. And this can vary, right, among species, just depending on their GI tract and their diet as well, okay? So it just is variable, but when you think about the majority of species, we're mostly absorbing in our large intestine. And of course, ruminants are a special group. They absorb it in their stomach. Now, when you talk about absorption, diarrhea decreases water absorption. So that makes sense, right? because your feces are more watery. So you have more water being excreted in the feces than you would normally. So you're not absorbing that water, which is very important, which is why dehydration can definitely be caused by diarrhea. So you have to be very careful when an animal or ourselves have diarrhea, which is why you have to increase your water intake to counteract that water loss. Okay, so diarrhea definitely decreases water absorption in the GI tract. So where does the water come from? How do we get water in our body to use? So this may make perfect sense, right? So we're going to drink water, right? That's probably our main form of water and water source. But we can also get water in or on our feed. So we've been talking a little bit about moisture content in our different diets, and that's very important, right? So some diets have more water than others, but there is probably some sort of amount of moisture in all of our feeds. So those are both our main sources of water. But I said, what about those species that are maybe desert species, hibernating species, right? So there are two other ways that our body can get water. So metabolic water, so we said cellular respiration creates water, right? So we use that, the sugar, right, glucose and oxygen, and we turn it into energy. But the byproducts of that are carbon dioxide and water, right? So water is a product of metabolism. So that's one way, right, that we can actually create our own water. Preformed water is another way, and this is very important for those desert and hibernating species, is we can actually catabolize those body tissues when we are in a negative energy balance, right? So if you're not ingesting your maintenance requirement, essentially, of energy, you have to start breaking down your own body tissues. So we like to break down fat, right? We like to break down proteins, muscle, right? Ideally, you don't really want to break down your muscle. You want to break down your fat first, right? Because that gives you probably the most energy. But when you break down those body tissues, you are going to get some water out of that metabolism, okay? Out of metabolizing those organic compounds. So that's catabolism, right? And that's happening in a lot of these species, right? They stock up for hibernation. They put on all of their weight, all of their fat, so that they're able to catabolize it over their hibernation period, right? So metabolic and preformed water are very important for those species that don't have access to water, essentially, either in their diet or just drinking water. So very important for those guys, okay? Otherwise, the rest of us really just drink and eat our water. So when we talk about the relationship between drinking water and how much water is in our feed, it's kind of an inverse relationship. So they're inversely related, meaning the more water content in a feed, the less water you actually need to drink. So the higher moisture content, the better, right, for the requirements of water. So you're getting that requirement of water in your feed, and you don't have to drink as much water. Okay, so that's what it means when they're inversely related. So higher moisture content feed requires less water to drink, but the reverse is true as well. So the higher dry matter, right? So the more dry matter, the more water you need to drink. So there's a big difference, say, with a grazing herbivore, right, that's out eating fresh grass, right? There's water on the grass, there's water in the grass, a high moisture content in that fresh grass, right? Versus what we usually feed them domestically, and that's hay, right? Which has been dried out. So that dry hay is going to have a lot less moisture in it than fresh pasture grass. And so that's something to take into consideration, that these animals that are eating hay that has a lot less moisture in it, they're going to require a lot more water than maybe an animal that is on pasture and fresh grass, okay? And so, like we said, we have this kind of balance of water turnover, right? Water in, water out, right? So you're bringing water in, you're utilizing it, and then you're going to excrete or have water loss as well, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about water loss. So we are continuously losing water, just at variable rates. So we're continuously losing water a few different ways, via the lungs, the skin, the kidneys. So there's going to be this continuous loss. So the number one we usually think about is via the kidneys, right, as urine. So that is a measurable loss, right? We can measure the water that is coming out in the urine. So that is a very measurable loss. Feces, right? So we don't have perfectly dry feces, and that is also species dependent. If you look at a cow versus a horse, right? So cow pies are very high in moisture, right? Lots of water loss there, versus a horse, which has kind of a more pelleted feces, right? So difference in the water loss of the feces, whereas urine is a much more consistent loss across species. Feces can be quite variable, okay? We also have what's called insensible loss, and that's kind of hard to calculate. We'll talk a little bit about that, and that's just kind of the continual loss of water in our lungs and on our skin. So kind of evaporative loss, okay, right? Breathing, moisture content, evaporation on the skin. It's kind of this continual loss that it's kind of hard to measure. So we call it insensible loss, which I think is kind of a weird word, but essentially think of it as kind of immeasurable loss, okay? Sweat, right? And that is also quite variable, because it can just depend on our physical activity and how much we're sweating, right? So urine and feces are a much more measurable loss. Insensible and sweat is a little less measurable. Obviously, we can kind of know how much we're sweating, and we know we're increasing our loss when we sweat. So the requirement of the water in is going to be a lot more, right? Because we're losing a lot more. So let's go through these individually, right? So urine loss, okay? So we have a lot of control over our kidney excretion, okay? We have a great ability to concentrate our urine, which means we can take back a lot more water into our body, right? Which we said is very important. If there's any sort of measurable loss in water in blood volume, we're going to tell those kidneys to absorb more water. So we have lots of control over how much water is lost in our kidneys and in the excretion. So that's one way that we are able to conserve water if we're in a water deprivated state, right? So you can, most animals will stop urinating. So that's quite controllable, right? So it also depends on what wastes you're excreting, okay? Because we actually use the water as a solvent for those wastes, right? Because essentially urine is just waste, metabolic waste, and water, right? So the water is a solvent for those different wastes, such as urea, right? So urea is a very common waste in urine. Okay, so it just depends, and species are different, right? So a bird is very different than a mammal for urine and what they're excreting, right? What kind of waste they're excreting. So just, talking about birds, why are they so different? They have kind of this semi-solid urine, which is very interesting, right? Because they're actually producing uric acid, which is a different type of waste than urea. So they're both nitrogenous waste or metabolic waste because they're getting rid of that nitrogen, but it's in a different form. And so uric acid is a lot more solid than urea. So it doesn't require as much water, essentially, right, to dissolve it. So it's a little more of a semi-solid state, which is kind of interesting. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about fecal loss. So we said this is a little more variable in the moisture content, the amount of water we actually lose in our feces. And this is very species dependent and diet dependent. Okay. So whereas we said it's a lot more calculable in the urine, this is a lot less. But in general, when we're talking about high fibrous diets, right, so such as our herbivores, they usually increase the percent of water lost in the feces. Okay, so they usually have a higher moisture content in their feces. And that's just kind of a general statement. But when you talk about these species that have pelleted feces, such as goats, sheep, and deer, they have a much drier feces. So even though they're eating a higher fibrous diet, they're better adapted actually for drier environments. So they're able to pellet their feces, which means it's going to have less moisture. So they're pulling more moisture out in their large colon than other maybe fibrous diet eating species. Okay. Now, when we talk about ruminants, and very specifically cattle, their fecal water loss is a lot higher than their urinary water loss, right? We talked about how soupy, how watery cow feces are, right? Versus other species. So other species, the urinary water loss should be more than the fecal water loss. So that's just kind of adaptations of different species in their environment, right? So cows require a lot of water for the high fibrous diet, okay? So just a little bit about that insensible loss. So it's really just the amount of fluid we lose daily, kind of in the respiratory system, in the integumentary system, which is the skin. So there's just kind of this constant loss, and it's hard to measure, right? So it's kind of it's not very easily measured. But I like this little picture because it just kind of shows you this kind of water in equals the water out, right? So whatever you're eating or drinking, you're going to be intaking some water. There's going to be water produced in your metabolic functions, your metabolism, and then you're going to lose water as well. So it should kind of equal each other out, okay? So again, the urine and feces are a lot more measurable, but the skin and lungs, the insensible loss is a little harder, but it kind of balances everything out, right? So it should equal zero. Water in should equal water out, essentially, right? So the last water loss possibility is through sweat, and not all animals sweat equally, right? So some of us sweat a lot, some of us not so much, and that's individually, but also across species, right? So there are animals that have very well-developed sweat glands, such as humans and horses. And in those types of species, sweating really increases our water loss significantly, right? So we do have a potential to lose a lot of water via sweat. More heat tolerant species actually sweat. So horses and humans are fairly heat tolerant species. You talk about other species like pigs and dogs, they don't sweat, right? So dogs pant, right? So they have evaporative cooling off of their tongue. Others, like pigs, they find shade and water to decrease their body temperature. So the old saying, I'm sweating like a pig, is actually couldn't be more false because pigs don't sweat like we do anyways, and they find other ways to cool themselves off. And some species even have some coloration to their sweat, such as hippopotamus. So just kind of that pinkish hue is their sweat. So just kind of fun differences across species, right? So sweat is not equal, that's for sure. So there are things that can affect water loss. So obviously we can increase our water loss in species that sweat. So sweat can increase water loss, which is kind of a known thing, but also environmental factors can affect water loss, right? So heat. So just like we talked about, right? So heat can definitely increase your water loss, especially in those species that can sweat. Accessibility to water, right? So what kind of water are these animals able to get to, right? So if you have less water coming in, hopefully you have less water going out, or you might become in a negative state where you're losing more water than you're taking in, right? So the accessibility of water can be very important, especially for our wild animals, right? Watering holes, but also, just containers, right? How much water are we offering these animals that can't find water on their own, right? So domesticated species as well can have a problem with accessibility to water too, right? And that's kind of the onus on us, right? As the keepers of these animals. So this can change your water loss, right? So it can increase your water loss and maybe potentially put you in a negative state where you're losing more water than you're taking in, and that can be where we get into trouble with dehydration. So now let's talk a little bit about what are our actual water requirements, right? So kind of when you're talking about drinking water, you kind of drink as much as you want, right? That's kind of the whole idea of offering free water to us and to animals, right? You kind of just drink water as you want water, but there is a direct relationship in the requirements of water, and that has to do with what you eat, right? So there's a direct relationship between our dry matter feed and our water requirement, right? So the more dry matter feed you eat, the more water you require, right? Because we said the higher moisture feeds, the less water you require. So it's back to that dry matter basis, right? So, which is why it is important to compare things on that dry matter basis. But this is another great way of utilizing that dry matter basis. And we roughly need, and this is not an exact science, right? Because we said that there are variants on the water that we need, right? Due to the water loss can be variable just between species, between diet, right? This is where the diet comes into play. So we need about 2 to 5 kilograms of water per kilogram of dry matter feed consumed, okay? So that's just kind of a rough estimate. There's also a difference between species, right, as well. So obviously diets can change that, and that's where this kind of calculation comes into play, is with their diet, but species can be different as well. So we already said that cattle kind of require a lot of water, mostly because of their diet, right? That high fibrous diet. They absorb water early on in their stomach, so they don't absorb a lot of water from their feed, and their feces are quite watery, right? So they're not kind of taking in that water in the colon, which is kind of the last stop, right, before excretion. So they're really not taking back a lot of the water from their diet, which is why they require more water than maybe other species. Horses, sheep, sheep are those pelleted feces species, right? Goats, sheep, deer, those kind of dry little nuggets of manure, versus horses are maybe a little less dry, right? But they're kind of in there in the middle of the road. Birds really require a lot less than most mammals. So again, you're getting into kind of other species there. So, but when comparing the mammals, that's kind of different, right? So obviously different species have different requirements, but you can kind of make this generalization where you have a direct relationship between the dry matter feed and the water requirement. So there's definitely a relationship between eating and drinking. And for a lot of species, they go hand in hand. So you eat, you drink. So if an animal stops eating, they can stop drinking, and that can be detrimental. But vice versa, if they stop drinking, they can stop eating. So definitely kind of have a negative feedback reaction there with some sick animals. So what happens if we're losing more water than we're taking in, right? So this is where we get into that negative water balance, where you're losing more or you're restricting water. What happens, right? So the first thing that happens is they actually stop eating. So they do decrease their feed intake when they're losing too much water, which doesn't really make sense, right? But we just said that the eating and drinking kind of go hand in hand for a lot of species. So if they stop drinking, they stop eating, and so there's this decrease in productivity, right? Because they don't have the energy requirement. So then you get into a decreased energy state as well, okay? Kind of bad cycles, right? So dehydration is technically an increase in blood concentration or decrease in blood volume. Okay, so you're increasing your blood concentration, decreasing the water in the blood, and that's technically dehydration. And dehydration can be so severe that you do have death, right? So we cannot function with severe dehydration. So what are the signs of dehydration, right? How do we stop this before obviously we reach, hopefully, the death or even the severe dehydration? So some symptoms of dehydration are a loss of skin elasticity or skin turgor. So a lot of different species have different areas on their body where you can do a skin turgor test, where you pinch up their skin, you tent their skin, and see how long it takes for the skin to bounce back to its original position. So if it doesn't go back very quickly, then you have a loss of the skin elasticity. So a lot of different species, that's a way to tell on different parts of their body, are a better place to test. So every species is a little bit different for that. A loss of appetite, right? So we just said if they're losing more water than they're taking in, they're going to stop eating, right? And that kind of goes along with the reduced energy, right? Reduced productivity. Obviously, any sort of vomiting with or without diarrhea is kind of an obvious sign that this animal could be in risk of or already dehydrated, right? Because you're definitely increasing that water loss significantly with vomiting and diarrhea. Panting, increased respiratory rate can be a sign even. So it's all this negative cycle, right? So if you're panting and increasing your respiratory rate, you're increasing that water loss even more because you're increasing that insensible loss, right? Sunken eyes, dry nose, sticky, dry gums, right? Those are all those membranes, mucous membranes, that are important way to tell that they are at a, too much water loss. So those are all ways that we can kind of just monitor for dehydration and dehydration symptoms. So just a little bit about kind of water quality and maybe water intoxication. So obviously more of our concern is not getting enough water and dehydration. But you can get water intoxication, and that is too much water intake after water deprivation. So kind of an old wives' tale is, you don't give a dehydrated animal free access to water because you think, oh, they're going to drink too much water, they're going to, explode their stomach. And it's fairly rare. It's fairly rare to get water intoxication. Okay, so yes, maybe give it to them in spurts, but it is fairly rare to actually get true water intoxication. Okay, usually you want them to have free access to water. But there is some problems with water quality, right? So there are some toxic substances that can be in the water, and there are specific things that we should be aware of, because there are some substances that can be toxic without a lot of effect on taste. So usually an animal is fairly good at sensing whether a water source is safe or not. But with things like this that don't really have much effect on taste, that can be the real danger. So things like nitrates, fluoride, some types of salts, and heavy metals may not have much effect on taste and can be quite toxic. Whereas other substances may have an effect on taste. So that may say, okay, they don't want to drink it, right? But if they accidentally ingest it, that could be just as dangerous. There was a thing going around with some blue-green algae in these water sources, and dogs were dying from this blue-green algae toxic substance in these water sources. So microorganisms can definitely be a problem, right? Bacteria, protozoa, even some fungi. But the algae, right? That was the big one in the news lately, the blue-green algae. But oils, pesticides, things like that, definitely oils, you would think they would be able to sense maybe some of these other things. But again, these are all can be toxic substances at certain levels. So we do have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that sets the upper limits of safety standards for some of these substances, because obviously we're going to have some of these things in the water no matter what, right? So what qualifies as a toxic level versus a safe, quote unquote, safe level? And that's where the EPA comes in, right, to set those standards for water quality. Okay? So just some things to think about. So next week, we're going to start kind of a series of lecture on our nutrients, right? So obviously we started with water. A lot of people forget that water is a nutrient, but now we're going to get into, some of the major nutrients and sources of energy, right? So first, we're going to talk about carbohydrates, one of my favorites, okay? All right, so I'll see you guys next week. Let me know if you have any questions. Swing by office hours, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks a lot.